Welcome to Oratio Podium, and in this episode of Debating Diaries, we have Naman with us, and Naman is a very experienced debater who has a lot of experience doing many tournaments internationally and nationally, both as a judge and as a debater or a speaker, as you might refer to him. We are very sure that Naman's rich experience and his discussions around different themes, which we have on board for this audio segment, would be very intuitive and beneficial to you as a listener. Now, Naman, before I go into the gist of what we will be discussing, would you like to say a bit about yourself and introduce yourself to the guests?
Hello, guys. I'm Naman Ganguli, and I am currently in my third year of debating in itself. And initially, I went ahead and started debating as a sort of scenario which I can use to prevent some level of stuttering, or I had a huge amount of stage fright in school itself. So I just went ahead and took up public speaking from then, and since then it's been going on and off. Like throughout school, I had debating, and then it went a bit off because I had my boards to focus upon. And then in university, I found a group of people. I got engaged in debating again. And since then, it's been like a roller coaster journey in itself, where I'm on the entire road to go ahead and prove myself in itself. So, by that logic, also, I've done like total currently at least 50 to 60 tournaments in itself, both national and internationally. And I've judged tournaments, I've debated in tournaments, and I've faced a lot of scenarios which a lot of people who are listening to this podcast also have faced. So yeah, I'm hoping to have a really engaging discussion with Kaushik here as well. So yeah, thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thank you very much, Naman. We are also glad to have you on board. I'm pretty sure there is a lot that you can reference to in terms of your journey, which would very much help all of our listeners. So let's just directly go and jump into it, right? So, when you were just getting into competitive debating, what would you say introduced you to this idea of competitive debating? And if there were any particular stories which you really had in terms of the first few tournaments or first few experiences?
In the initial stages of my debating career, I in my university scenarios, I got introduced into a college level institution in itself, where I got access to debating since that institution in itself. So once I went to the institution, I learned the basics of APD from one of my previous mentors. And after I learned the basics of APD, BPDs, and all of those scenarios, I just went into my first tournament, which I remember was Pratija 2022 or 2023 or 2022, something like that. So in that scenario, when I went into that tournament, firstly I was highly and extremely nervous, because even if I am trained to that extent that I know the laws of and rules of debating in itself, I don't just go ahead and say something or something like that, right? I'm fearing of messing up, something like that. So at that point of time, when I went into the tournament, firstly I was nervous, and then once the rounds went on, I usually do something which I still do to an extent. I'm much more calmer now, but previously I used to speak in anger to that extent, that okay, how did the opposition offend me with their bad case or something like that, and that helped me remove my fear of like public speaking to that extent, fear of stuttering and stuff like that. So yeah, it was a really good tournament. I was, I think, ninth best speaker in that tournament in itself. I did not break. I was a reserve break tournament, but it was a really good experience in the tournament, because I got to meet a lot of people within the tournament, including Kaushik himself. I met them at Pratija in itself. Maybe not a very formal welcome at that point of time, but later I got to know him much better. So yeah, it was a beginning into the world of debating, and well, I credit all that I am to the entire idea of me getting introduced into the scenario in the first place. And then from then I went on to tournaments like Rahat PD 2023, went on to tournaments uh I think Gambit 2023. All of those tournaments in itself I went in freshers debates, and it just continued on since then.
You mentioned something around the fact that, right, that memory of debating in that first tournament was very interesting to you. It became something very convincing to you, as a matter of fact, because a lot of people need convincing to continue debating, right? Because they don't have the energy or the motivation to, because sometimes it becomes a very monotonous activity, or maybe it's very scary because there are all these experienced debaters keeping up with rhetoric and then keeping you on and on and on engaged in logical arguments which might not make any sense to you when you're starting out, especially it didn't to me. So there is always this particular moment of time when you click and you want to do this more seriously. So was there anything particular about these couple of initial tournaments or experiences which made you think like, oh yeah, this is why I want to continue?
In this sort of scenarios, when I went into Pratija itself, right, like round one, this is a sort of memorable story for me. I was opposition to, I think, some like someone from an alternate institution from Odisha in itself, right? It was a sort of round local tournament, and my mentor was judging me, and the person who taught me debating, essentially that person was judging me, and in opposition was some senior people. Like they weren't, I think, senior debaters. They were also, I think, first time debaters, but they were senior to me in like collegiate level and stuff like that. So when I was debating and then I won that round itself, it was like a huge boost of confidence. But then my mentor also had this ability to go ahead and state me exactly at what point I messed up and stuff like that. So once that reality check was also in, I also understood that okay, these scenarios I need to improve in for me to go ahead and improve in debating. As for the particular like scenario that I need to continue doing this, it came in to the extent that after Pratija ended, to that exhilaration when I'm seeing that okay, I'm ninth best speaker in the tournament itself, in my first ever tournament, that sort of like thrill that you get once you're getting some level of victory. Or thirdly, that entire idea that okay, I can speak for 7 minutes without going ahead and stuttering or without messing up to an incredible level that like I am blanking out or stuff like that. All of the scenarios combined just made me realize that okay, there may be a debater in me.
That's pretty interesting you say that, right? Because unless you have that factor to motivate you and convince you to continue, you really are stuck in a rut. So I'm pretty sure that that would have been a very important junction for you as well. And a lot of other people who are listening in would also feel that it's necessary to have that achievement or that sense of belongingness to this activity so that they can continue as well. But you mentioned a couple of other interesting things in the first end of your introduction too. For example, when you're saying that you're in a institute and you're in your third year, it definitely becomes harder for you to manage all of these academic commitments, especially being, if I'm not wrong, from an engineering background. How do you manage these academics with your debating journey? How do you sort of like motivate others who are looking into this activity to do so as well?
Funnily enough, few days before I was reading some bio of some cap individual, right? And in there, they had written in their bio, like the title of their bio was "Sacrificing my GPA for debates," and essentially, like, okay, managing something is really tough when you consider one thing that you're really passionate about and the other thing that you have to do if you want to survive in the corporate world as well. But yeah, managing happens on the idea that I primarily do debates on weekends, and on weekdays I attend college and do all of my university work, academic work. I have to manage that as well. Like after I'm going into like in night time as well, I go ahead and do debates in different circuits itself, where debates start at like 11 or 12 and then go until 1 or 2. And I barely get like 5 hours of sleep. Like I know it's an unhealthy sleep cycle, something like that, but I cope up with it to that extent that yes, I'm doing something which I'm passionate about. So yeah, managing is difficult, but it's possible if you love the sport and you love the art of debating.
You call debate a sport. I very vehemently keep saying to people that debate is a sport. It's not really that much of like just a solo competition. What makes you think that debate is a sport? Because I'm very curious about this from a personal standpoint. Because I'm so motivated to call it a sport, and then I keep encouraging people to see it as a sport. But then, what are your thoughts about it?
People essentially try to see debating as the way that okay, you're talking about some level of intellectual dialogue or something like that with individuals, right? But understand, the moment you are making it in a competitive sphere, the moment you're making it a team game to that extent, the moment you are including things like synergy between teammates, things like impacts performances among individuals, when you're implementing credentials in that scenario, you essentially make it a sport in itself. Why? Simply because on the idea that yes, you are having intellectual conversations with people, but you are having intellectual conversation with people which lead to an outcome. Either you win that sort of argument or you lose that sort of argument. Whatever happens, in the essence that you are trying to improve in the way you're argumenting, and you need to improve in the way that you're going at and like explaining your case, you're going at and achieving higher and higher. That essentially is a metric which then makes the entire idea of debating in itself, which is sportsman-like or as a sport to an extent. Yes, it's based on dialogue, but it's also something which is based on the sport itself.
You really need to look at debating as a whole, right? Holistically, if you look at debating, as you mentioned, there's a lot of cultural connotations to it. There's a lot of innovation to it. There's a lot of intellect application to it, but it's not like it's unapproachable for different people. um, I keep saying this to a lot of my students when I teach them as well, right? That debating is a skill. You improve your skill by doing it more and more. And I think you would also attest to this, that since you've done so many tournaments over a long period of time, you have definitely improved than say from when you were starting out. Say, for example, you mentioned your first tournament was Pratidja, right? So I think that was also like a journey for all of us. And sports is also something which you gain more skills at and become more active at. And gain some knowledge or gain degree of experience to become better. So I think that becomes an important point which people miss out on, and since they don't consider it a skill, they often get up in front of this wall where they believe that they can't grow or they can't do better, which is a major point that a lot of novices reach and don't continue beyond. But in this sort of conversation, a very important factor about culture also comes in, because a lot of different cultural identities are expressed due to people from different areas approaching this activity, right? So I'm pretty sure that you would also have some cultural beliefs which would have reflected in debating, and there would have also been other cultural beliefs which changed your idea about debating. So how do you think culture has a particular effect in debating spaces, and how do you think your culture background and your, say, experiences in these particular areas would have changed your idea about how debating was or is?
I think culture is also based on the socio-economic background that individuals have, right? At a point of time, we are talking about debating access to individuals in itself. It's also something which is lacking to some people, which is existent more to some degree of people based on their socio-economic backgrounds as well. Me as an individual who comes from a normal middle class family and who is just attending university, the only escape which I got through debating was either on school level when I was in a prestigious institution which actually had debating unions and the debating colleges. A lot of people across India don't. But secondarily, there is also like this idea of lack of access in universities as well, because a lot of universities exist which do not have prominent debating unions. And there are budding debaters there who are not able to access the idea of debating in itself, because without an union you don't have a mentor to go ahead and teach you something, you don't have a community of people you can be a part of. It takes a lot to gain the access in the community in the first place, right? So a lot of scenarios exist, inaccessibility exists, but culture also reflects on debating in a different manner as well. When you consider the idea that okay, like debating styles differ from like a different level of circuits, like Indian debating style is inherently different from like European debating styles or Indonesian debating styles or African debating styles. That's where the culture part also comes in, because certain people, like certain circuits, value some things more within the aspect of debating versus some things which they value in other aspects of debating. Which means that a proper comparative, if I go and explain to you, that is, Indian circuits goes ahead and values argumentations to a greater extent, meaning that they are going to provide six, seven, eight argumentations within their entire case to try and provide as much impact that they can within the debate. While like African scenarios and African circuits, which I'm proximate towards, they try to provide a lot more principled analysis. They'll not have as many argumentations, but the argumentations they do have is going to be well proven to the extent that a lot of people buy into that scenario. So yeah, culture affects debating in this manner as well, on the accessibility metric as well, and on the metric of how you're debating as well.
Entire conversation around culture really drew two main points to focus, right? One about debating societies across the world and how cross cultural and boundary less debating as an activity has become, but also around the fact that debating societies in India have different natures to debating societies, say, for example, elsewhere. So, in this next podcast segment, we'd like to discuss more about, say, these debating societies and these cultural differences which come up, right? So, for example, if you're discussing university debating, it's very different, say, what it is in Europe to what it is in the United States to what it is in the United Kingdom. A lot of format differences, a lot of differences in terms of the way that people speak, the way that arguments are better characterized, or the way that things are better looked at in terms of the judging systems as well. A lot of different things change. So, how do you think that the current state of university debating is in India, and what things do you think are particularly noticeable?
Current state of university debating in India is something which is growing, but also limited to certain hotspots across the country. Which looks like there are certain hotspots in and around like Delhi. There are certain hotspots in and around like southern India, like Bombay or VIT. All of those are prominent DevSocs which exist within India in itself. But the problem which then occurs is the idea that when you consider these DevSocs in itself, there are a lot of like universities which do not have as many prominent DevSocs, or if they are having this level of prominent DevSocs existing within India, there is a scenario which they sometimes do, which a lot of like good people actually go ahead and do. That is try to gatekeep information to an extent, which means that there are certain DevSocs which then go ahead and have some level of information which they try to keep from other university level debaters as well. Like if they're having some WUDC level judge or speaker in their like repertoire in their like the society in itself, then they're trying to not let other people gain access to that very same level of information to that extent. They want their own depths of people to succeed. Now that is another problem of accessibility which exists currently within the Indian sphere of debating as well, because at a point of time not a lot of people are getting that level of access to the level of training which is required for them to exceed and succeed at the WDC level, at the UADC level, at the world's level in itself. It just means that the people who are inherently not getting access to debating in itself are people who are not even getting access to that extent, and people who are not inherently getting access, like who are intermediate debaters but want to be better, they're also not getting that level of access which these hotspots have. So on that same idea, this gatekeeping of information is something which is slowly decreasing to that extent, because there are some level of callouts existing, there are some level of morality clauses also existing, right? That it's not ethical to do so. So this is slowly getting like normalized in nature. But apart from that, I think it's a growing sport currently in India, where school children are also getting involved in this, where university debaters also getting involved in this. And I just hope in the future, I think 10 years, we can go ahead and see like a few champion teams in WDC from the Indian circuit as well, like, considering the current growth as well.
So it's very prominent that we need a lot of cultural shocks and changes across debating societies in India to enforce that kind of ideal or belief, I guess, as well. Because I think the first thing that came into my mind when I heard you speaking about, say, these issues in the university debating societies, I also believe that debate fundamentally as an activity has become more conflict oriented and oriented towards, say, gaining something rather than it being a community, being a bit more holistic, for example, so that it can be more embracing and also help others grow. Because at the end of the day, when you have this community space and you're helping each other grow, you become better debaters as well as better speakers at the end of the day. But regrettably, that's a very nonchalant approach towards a lot of different individuals and a lot of different communities. And I think that's also something that needs a lot of change. And I also agree that there's a lot of potential for Indian debate to become much more global and much more vocal in the long run as well, right? But when you have, say, experiences like you have, Naman, in different tournaments across the world, you mentioned something around Africa, you mentioned something around other international circuits. But do you think there's a chance that India can improve access, or is there somewhere beyond India which has better access? Do you think India lacks in terms of access to societies and tournaments in general?
The lack of access is something which is like divided into like some sort of institutional issue, then a national issue, and then on the issue of the global scale in itself, where a certain like countries coming from Asia also to a degree lack access to, I think, like WDC or wherever, right? Because they do not possess the socio-economic capability to go in that tournament and perform, right? But apart from that itself, India can go ahead and provide access. There is existent access to these other circuits as well within India itself. The integration of African and Indian circuits is also there, where we see frequently people like Ogundare Taitobi, the person who is prominent in African circuits, capping in Indian tournaments as well, right? Now when you understand there is this integration being done recently, and it's very important for this integration to occur, it just makes sure that Indian people are also getting the exposure to African level of debating as well, and African debaters are also getting exposure to the Indian style of debating as well, which also leads to the holistic growth of debating styles as well, where not one country is restricted to a similar style of debating. And that is very essential for people to understand, because at a moment that you're going world level, you need to have some level of like compatibility to the world level itself, because not every judge there will understand your style of debating. So at a point of time that you know that you have an European judge, you can modify. And if you are have style debating in the Indian style of debating to that extent, you might not get the best level of judgment or best level of buy-in to your case, because it's inherently convincing the judge after all, right? So in that scenario, if you're compatible to other forms of debating itself, it's very prominent in nature that you can succeed at the global stage as well. And also it's holistic for debating as a whole in itself, as the culture itself.
Pretty true. I think when you mentioned that there's a chance for cross-border reflection and a chance for growth across borders for debating, you think about globalization being run as a prominent case in a lot of debates, right, in terms of a lot of topics. But this globalization has a lot of different nuances to it, which I think you also were sort of hinting towards. But do you think that therefore, when this globalization is occurring and people are getting sort of like beyond their own borders and going into, say, different styles of debating, do you think that this fast tracks the growth that debating as a community faces, or do you think that there is a lot more that we need to be careful about as well? Because inherently, when you're talking about globalization, there's also a lot of different problems that occur, right? Because For example, it might cause more confusion in the short term rather than more orientation towards a solution of the problem. So, do you think that there is any sort of sustainable way in which this can be done? Or do you think that there are certain challenges which you might face while doing this? Or is it overall a better thing to do?
The idea is gradual globalization, right? At a point of time that you're gradually exposing a circuit to different other circuits as well, you're gradually exposing the prominent members of the circuit, and then they're spreading the knowledge itself that okay, this circuit prioritizes this level of argumentation, the European circuit prioritizes mechanization maybe, or the Indonesian circuit goes ahead and tries to out like prioritize framing of the debate to a much greater extent. When you're spreading that, like taking that knowledge in itself, prominent members, and then spreading it among your own institutions, it's much easier for your juniors and the people who are new to debating it to buy into that argument itself, right? Confusion will only occur if you like just leave an individual and not provide them any level of guidance through that like sort of style of debating in itself. At a point of time, there are people who can guide you. There are people who are exposed to this sort of circuit, to like prominent people existing in Indian circuits as well, who are exposed to maybe LSE, who are exposed to Harvard IB tournaments, or who are exposed to maybe American tournaments or exposed to African tournaments. If they can try to train individuals, if they can try to tell individuals that okay, you can improve your debating style by incorporating this sort of manner of debating in itself, and you can succeed in these circuits as well. If that is taught effectively, I think this sort of confusion is something which will be seized to a greater extent, right? Confusion will only occur when you're lacking guidance to that greater extent, and gradual globalization of this.
There are certain challenges also, no? Because what would be the incentive for senior debaters to come and do this? Because there's a lot of issues in terms of access. Because either there's not a willingness for people to do it, because otherwise seniors have always existed, mentors have always existed, but people are not really willing to come and do this. So, do you think there's any chance of changing that?
Yeah, there's a chance of changing that. The problem that people are not willing to engage into debating is because they view debating as like just a sport, which means that they don't go ahead and are passionate about debating to that extent. They view debating that okay, if I'm debating, I'm only debating to win. That mentality is something which needs to change among current youth and current novice debaters as well if they want to grow to that extent. Because at a point of time that you are having some level of like idea that okay, I'm debating because I'm passionate about this, I'm watching speeches from WDC scenarios, I'm watching and learning from UDC debaters or something like that, or all of these debates, I'm learning how to provide my argumentations and analysis in itself, I'm learning on my own to that greater extent. At that point of time, then you realize that yes, you're passionate about the art of debating rather than just going ahead and winning tournaments in itself. At a point of time, that is something which is established as a culture among like individuals within India or in the global stage as well. I only know of India of this problem in itself. So if that is established, I think there is a lot more idea that these people will go ahead and inherently approach you to teach you that okay, how do I run this specific argumentation maybe, sir, or how do I go and make my case in a way that is a lot more holistic than my current ability. I think this access is limited by the like mental barriers which people have, some sort of nervousness to not go ahead and approach the seniors in itself, or the mental barriers that okay, I'm not, maybe I'm not good enough or something like that. Understand? I was an average speaker. I still consider myself an average speaker, and I always think I'll be an average speaker. I'm just there to go ahead and improve in the art which I'm trying to master, in the art which I am trying to be passionate about, right? At a point of time, even I can consider that. I think you, as an average speaker or a normal person, can also go ahead and try to consider that as an extent. So, if you go ahead and try, the solution will always be there. That's the thing.
I think individuals need to be more goal oriented. I think they're missing out on the factor that their motivation should be their own and that their goals are their own as well. So, if you really want to improve in the art of debating, you really need to put your foot down and say, right, I need to sit down and learn these couple of things. I need to do these few things so that I can be better at my activity. But in my opinion, also, there is a lot of things missing in the mentality or the skills that are required because of the fact that there's a lack of willingness to approach it that way, right? They're inherently always saying that okay, I'm not winning, I'm not really doing well, why do I continue? I think that is also where the problem lies, and which is why they don't approach these mentors or these opportunities. And sometimes it's just stubbornness or pride or ego which comes into play, and where people are like, we don't need to improve, we know what we are always winning, or we are always better than the others, or they think of themselves as better. And I think that creates also a bit of a toxicity in the entire script of things. But that's then again, that's a lot of different emotional things go into debating, because it's a very passionate sport for a lot of people, and then you have to navigate things closely. But Naman, I think you're being very charitable by saying that you don't think of yourself as a decent speaker and you're just average. But we'll move on to the next part very quickly here. In terms of, say, your journey as well, right? I'm pretty sure that being average is an untruth, because you've done this for 3 years and you have gained some experiences. But when you've done this for 3 years, you would have definitely seen some evolution in the Indian debating circuit, especially being somebody who was debating through COVID as well, right? So do you think that there's been certain significant changes in the circuit over the past couple of years?
I mean, as far as I'm aware, the circuit has gained quite a lot more experience, especially during the COVID years in itself, which means that I was not knowing about the circuit itself before COVID in itself. So at a point of time that when I'm debating throughout these COVID years or something, or just after the COVID years or stuff, I've seen the evolution of the circuit to that extent that the people who are actually mentors to other people, mentors to their juniors or stuff like that, those people are essentially a lot more experienced in the world level debating as well, which means COVID as an essence exposed India to a huge amount of global scenario as well, because a lot of tournaments like WDC, UDC went online, right? So when it went online, it meant that a lot of people were exposed to the global style of debating. They got a lot more passionate. This entire barrier of socioeconomic scenarios which was there got receded to an extent because people were participating in an online environment. So that essentially then made sure that, okay, if one, India got to represent their skills to a much greater degree on the international forum. International forum also recognized that, okay, India is there, as a huge amount of talent is there to be exploited in India. And that's what I think. After that, I've seen people, prominent people like Hadar Goldberg take interest in India in itself and try to train Indian debaters to an extent and hold workshops and stuff, and a lot of international social capital coming into India and trying to establish themselves, right? So at a point of time that is happening, feel the evolution is something which is quite a more positive in nature. Like, it was a sort of tipping point which existed the moment COVID came, and debating sort of bloomed in India to that extent. It's still blooming to the idea that it's growing. It's creating some level of instances where individuals are a lot more interested in debating, not just for the art that, okay, I'm trying to win trophies or something like that, but for the art of intellectualism, for the art of philosophical discourse and dialogue, and lastly for the art of getting something back for your country in a WDC standard as well.
Just a couple of other things here, right? The last question for this segment. When you say that there's certain differences in terms of concentration of skills in cities, do you feel that there's really a divide in different parts of the country?
Yeah, honestly, there is a divide existing, which means exactly what I said, that is the gatekeeping of information. Which means at a point of time that certain prominent international people come out and train debaters from certain institutions. I just fail to then realize that why then does that institution not make this workshop or everything accessible to a lot of people and not just their debaters to that extent, right? And that is something which has prominently occurred in a lot of scenarios as well. There are certain prominent circuits which also go ahead and have some level of I would say institutional bias towards their own debaters in itself. They want their own debaters to succeed at the cost of other debaters suffering from some level, I think, unfair judgment to that extent, or unfair treatment to that extent, lack of access maybe. So all of these scenarios are there because these debate circuits want to gatekeep, one, their achievements, and two, the ability for an individual to get these achievements in the first place. And this is very prominent in nature in India currently as well, considering the more India gets exposed to this globalization scenario, the more this idea of gatekeeping of access is something which is occurring to an extent, but it's more evident now for a lot of people to understand that this gatekeeping is occurring, which means there are a lot of other actors existing which can try and prevent this gatekeeping from being occurred in the first place, right? So all of these scenarios, I think, just are existent. There are certain, the reason there are hotspots existing is because there was a lack of access to other places, right? So yeah, that is the scenario.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's geographical restrictions as well. You can't travel pretty frequent. There are not enough tournaments happening in a particular area. So I think that creates a lot more burden on you and a lot more problems in terms of access. But I think the manner in which COVID happened, regrettably, it had to be a pandemic with such a loss of life and other problems to resolve these issues. But it does seem that there are a lot more solutions available in the market right now. Before, there was not really any online competition which was heard of, but now it has become some sort of a commonplace activity which is happening in the world, right? So I think that also evolves a lot in your way in which you're approaching these tournaments, in the way that you're thinking about access, and the way that you're approaching these things. Because people, for example, traveling across, say, cities would be fundamentally a problematic thing when you're doing this multiple times over a month. So it becomes really important for us to sort of crucially understand how we can sort of image these hotspots, and then also work towards building bridges between them and sort of reconciling a lot of the issues, which I'm pretty sure that was correct in your appreciation of the fact that there is a lot of gatekeeping and a lot of access issues which are happening in these prominent places. But the other interesting thing that you have faced in your journey, Naman, I'm sure, is your decisiveness towards, say, international tournaments and the activities that you're doing around this. You've judged and you've spoken. So let's just go into somewhat your journey and experience going through these things. So if you're saying there are certain particular strategies that you would say have for approaching these international tournaments and to do better in international tournaments as a novice or a beginner, or say an intermediate debater who is there only in the national level, how do you think somebody should approach this?
Primarily, they should approach this by gaining access to the regular mocks or regular spars which these individuals or which these circuits have, right? Like, for example, in the scenario that I got exposed to Indonesian level of debating, they have certain WhatsApp groups where they conduct regular mocks in itself, where they try to spar against people, or in the African circuit as well, they are currently having a lot of regular spars existing, right? And they call mock spars essentially. So in the scenario that there is, for you to get direct exposure to what the circuit believes in, to what the circuit considers as great debating and stuff like that, all of these scenarios are like much more highlighted when you go into those bars, when you gain experience within those bars and mocks in itself. So that is one thing which is there. But secondarily, also when you're a novice person trying to get access to the circuits in itself, or an intermediate trying to get access to the circuits, it essentially is also like very like beneficial for you to then go ahead and find a mentor who is already having this level of access in the first place, a mentor who can guide you within the circuit and actually help you find more people who can help you within the circuit itself. Which looks like, then for me, like my introduction to the circuit in itself was something which Shubhajyoti actually helped me. My, like, he's my friend and my mentor as well. So in that scenario, when he introduced me to a lot of people who I regularly had spars with, who I regularly had conversations after spars with, intellectual conversations which led to developing of friendships, and then it also led to developing of social capital within those circuits in itself, which I can then utilize to provide my juniors a sort of inclusive space where they can learn what their style of debating is and how they can improve their own style of debating, or create a like a sort of cultural merge between both of these styles of debating in itself, and not get like confused or not get extremely like nervous out of the scenarios in the first place, right? So yeah, I think that is very important for somebody to go ahead and do in the first place. And lastly, I think based on strategy in itself, at a point of time that you're going to the circuits, don't go into the circuit and thinking that you're going to beat a lot of people. Right. Just go into the circuit primarily thinking that, one, you're going to learn stuff. You're going to learn what this level of debating looks like, learn all these scenarios in the first place.
As people who have also been, say, part of the spectrum in terms of debating and judging, but also in terms of the way that administrations run debating institutions, or say things like debating societies and colleges, do you think that there is a lot of tremendous problems in terms of institutional support for different individuals? And what kind of dynamics do you think differ in terms of, say, being an independent debater without institutional support, or being an institutional debater through, say, getting some institutional support?
The problem with institutional support in itself is there is a lot of politics which is at play, which looks like at a point of time that I was also part of my former institution which I was a part of before I went independent. There was a lot of politics which occurred within the institution. And at a point of time that I am a budding debater, I am trying to learn debating and stuff like that from that institution in itself. This politics is something which hindered my progress, and I was like, okay, rather than just doing that, let's just go independent at a point of time that I'm having like a community of people already to rely upon in the international and national forum as well. I found that community of people and I just chose them over my current institution, which was also not favoring my growth at all. So at a point of time, there are a lot of people existing in the current debating circuit as well. People who are independent in nature just because their institution could not support them to that extent. There were a lot of politics at play, a lot of biases at play, and they also thought that their goals might have been different from what the institution wanted to achieve in the first place. So at a point of time that exists, this just means that yes, institutions and administration problems exist, people go independent. And now then, from the challenges of independent scenarios in itself, understand the challenges are a lot more limited on the same idea that yes, if you find a mentor, if you find a community of people who are going to support you within that journey of independent scenarios itself, like you find people who are like very experienced in nature, you find people like yes, I also just found Kaushik in itself when I went to a random tournament. I went met him as cap panel as well, right? So when you find these sort of experienced people when you're independent in nature, it just helps you also grow based on whatever feedbacks they get, based on whatever scenarios you get. Why? Because your growth is then controlled by you and you only. It's not hindered by an institution, but it's also not like progress by an institution, which means at a point of time that some institution is providing you some level of benefit which you think can benefit your goals in itself, that then looks like that you can also go ahead and have some level of like benefit from that institution. You can stay a part of that institution, but at a point of time that is not something which is you're getting that level of access or something like that, then you can just go ahead and not be a part of the institution in the first place, and you can go independent once you find the community that is right.
I think the right fit is the most important question here, right? You have to have, say, a community of like-minded peers which motivate you or who motivate you to do better, because otherwise it's a very draining and very, say, life non-enduring capacity you have with life and the other challenges that it throws to you, right? Because it completely drains your entire batteries out, and you really, really, really can't go on. But then I think the other end of the spectrum, when you talk about international circuits and representation, is how you sort of think of India as a complete bid to the WDC process. Because we discussed in brief in a previous segment about how WDC becomes important for, say, debaters in India, and how different dynamics would involve better chances for India as a circuit or as a country to do better as a national representation towards world university debating competitions, right? But I think let's discuss a bit more is fundamentally what the issues are around this. In this segment, let's see how we can cope better and do better. So the first thing that I would sort of like to discuss is, where do you think the problem lies? What is the barrier? What is the problems for developing nations to conquer WDC?
The primary problem which resides is one, the culture of debating is something which is already lacking in these developing countries. The reason WTC as a separate segment got English second language scenario itself, right? So when that is already lacking inherently, and secondarily on the idea that these developing nations are something which we call on economics belong from the global south, which then looks like these individuals do not possess the same level of socio-economic capacity as the huge like north global north countries in itself. So when they don't possess that, they also don't possess the same level of social capital which like countries from like European institutions possess, or the American institutions possess. Then like countries like Africa, countries from African nations or countries from Indian nations suffer, as there is one, a very lack of representation which was highlighted in the Panama WDC which happened here, which happened in 2025. And also there was a huge amount of like lack of access as well, because like even paying the registration fees for the WDC scenario is something which is almost like a dream for a lot of Indian experienced debaters who want to go there but can't because of the socio-economic disparities as well. So yeah, I mean that is a sort of problem. I would love to hear your views on this as well.
What you say is true, right? Because when I bid for going to WDC, I didn't have a lot of institutional support and we had to pay out of pocket. And this was when WDC happened online. And I still could get a waiver to a certain degree because there are some reg waivers available. But funding for debating has started drying up and these reg waivers are not possible. But since that year WDC was online, I really didn't have to worry about visa or fees. And I think the entire problem around that is that visa costs skyrocket. So does cost for traveling. Like it can be 1 lakh or 2 lakhs just to go to and from the venue, because it's usually very Eurocentric or centric towards the Western countries where the WDCs are actually occurring. Very rarely you can see this representation in Southeast Asia or other circuits where WDC happens in these areas. But then again, there's regrettably a lot to do and a lot to discuss. For me, I think personally, a lot of access issues and problems occur in the way that people are having these barriers set up for other people to represent themselves and their countries in these competitions. But it has changed, right? Because there's a lot more pre WDC opportunities. There's a lot more changes which have happened to the international tournaments accessibility. Call outs do help, like you've mentioned before as well, Naman. But I think there's a lot more potential there. So, what do you think? Do you think that there is enough accessibility there or enough representation? Do you think there's anything that we can do right now to increase the expected accessibility or range of participation?
Yes, there is a lack of accessibility currently. That problem is there. That problem nobody can deny that there isn't there, right? So at a point of time, then you talk about institutional support as well. Understand a lot of institutions do not even understand what debating looks like. The reason is institutions usually provide funding to you when you have a guarantee of an outcome, which looks like that you're guaranteed to go ahead and get some level of utility from going to a WDC tournament. At a point of time, you cannot guarantee an outcome in a subjective sport like debating in itself. It just then makes you convincing all of those individuals that okay, provide me like 1 or 2 lakh funding because I need to pay the registration fee of a dub world universities debating championship, something which is very unlikely for you to get, especially in developing nations, because these people do not exactly understand what WDC means to an actual debater, right? And at a point of time that exists, that barrier is something which is like very problematic, and that needs to go away inherently. And secondarily, there is also an in problem based on the idea that WDC waivers which they provide to teams are something which they're less likely to provide to teams from like developing nations to that extent, which I've seen throughout the years. Why? Because these developing nations require a lot more funding to be able to come, right? Like travel waivers and all of those scenarios which they provide. And even a 50% travel waiver is something which people do not actually get in the scenario itself. At a point of time that you are not getting that level of travel waivers or HV waivers in itself, it just then looks like that you are inherently cut off from that sort of WDC tournament itself. Then I don't think that the World University Debating Championship, the world word, holds any value to that extent if you're not having like 60% of the world's population not being represented to the greatest extent.
I mean, that's true. I think it's more than 60, right? China has a billion or so, India has a billion or so. That's nearly one fourth of the world. Then and there. And then there's a lot more in other countries too. Because even if you say circuits like Australia, they do have a lot more social capital to actually understand these kind of competitions and send these people. And they have that sort of sponsorship and other things. But even established universities in these countries can send people. Because countries like Australia do have a lot of available resources in the institutional level where institutions understand these things because they've been part of the early stages of development of these activities. And since it's been harbored for a long time, it's been sort of like channeled for a long time into these institutions, they have gained a much more broader acceptance to this activity, and then they open up their purse, if you might say it in that sense, to these people who want to approach them. And I've known fantastic debaters from Australia just participate in a lot of competitions and do better just because that term of accessibility is present for them. So I think that what you're saying is very true, right? Because accessibility issues will survive beyond us probably, to the extent maybe lesser so than what it is today. But definitely there will be some sort of accessibility issues when there's such a big economic divide, and also a divide in social perception of the activity and economic perception of people who are going to open their purse and maybe give you some money to sponsor you to travel. I think there are changes. Online debating has helped, but we are still a long way off. There might be certain merit in exploring hybrid opportunities for these tournaments, which are very truly supposed to be global. But then again, there are a lot of other problems which come around, which I think would need to be factored in. But this brings very important consideration into, say, how you perceive the economic factor that an individual has to debating, right? Because I think you've done a lot of international tournaments. Have you ever felt it economically non-viable to do these tournaments, and what do you think you would have liked better as a support mechanism?
Yeah, quite a lot actually. Like if you consider Australs as a tournament or any sort of tournament where you have to travel, then the reg fees are something and the travel is something which is almost like impossible for an average middle class guy studying at college itself to pay itself, right? Secondarily, if you consider that okay, that is an online tournament itself, even that in that case there are like reg fees of $20, $100, $50, where you have to go ahead and pay for a lot of American tournaments to be accessible to you at a point of time, right? And these tournaments like the Vienna pre-WDC which happened recently, all of those tournaments in itself are something which you need some level of fee waivers to pay, because even $100 suddenly you need to pay for you to get access to a tournament is also something which a lot of people do not have at the current status quo. So at a point of time, you also understand that there is another scenario about accessibility which I would like to highlight as a sort of scenario story in itself, right? Like I was seeing the WDC ESL finals itself, and I was seeing Sharon's speech start, right? In the start of the speech, he gave the first thank you note to his parents for supporting him to go into this sort of WDC scenario itself, supporting his travel, supporting his entire WDC journey, his debating journey in itself, right? So that also highlighted a very important part in a debater's life, that is parental support to that extent. And I realize that this is something which is like a harping on topic for every new scenario which exists. Like gamers also don't get parental support or something like that. But yeah, at a point of time that you're passionate about something, at a point of time there is a culture existing where people are accepting that debate is something which can bring some level of social utility to the individuals. It can bring some level of utility to the nation as well, because it's, after all, national representation. If an Indian team wins, it's an Indian team. It does not get characterized that by the university itself. So when people realize this, I think there is going to be a lot more degrees of access, lot more sponsorships existing, right? Because yes, like currently there are children who are also learning, there are school children who are also learning about debating or going into WSDCs, who are part of ISDS organizations. And I feel a lot more organizations like ISDS, to an extent, which can try and make debating to a degree accessible, or free organizations existing which can make debating to accessible to people, can provide funding to people, investors existing for this scenario, can go ahead and make it a lot more accessible. Because understand, we can only hope for change in our system in itself. At a point of time, we're trying to hope for change in the WDC council or WDC, how our WDC operates, is something which is like very unreasonable for us to hope to that extent, right? We can hope still that the WDC council will somehow try to provide a lot more fee waivers or stuff like that, but that is the case, right? We can only solve local problems first and then focus on the international ones.
I have also surprisingly seen a lot of unique concepts when it comes to WDC fundraising. There used to be certain tournaments which were solely held to fund people going to WDC by independent DevSocs. They were called WDC fundraisers or some other funky name, fundraising tournaments and all. I've seen all of that happen. Not so much frequently, but it did happen once upon a time. And those are interesting ways in which some support from your community has helped. Because, of course, the administration can't be convinced to pay you so much money, so maybe just run a tournament and try to make it some sort of profit making enterprise in which you can sort of send somebody to the tournament. That's a good idea in theory, but sometimes in practice it might not be the best way in terms of approaching this, because it doesn't give you, say, the chance to always succeed or be capable of generating enough funds to do, but it does put a dent on the budget, right? But then that brings us to the close of that segment. And it's really interesting that you have shared with us all of these fantastic perspectives of how these issues can be addressed. But on to our final part, right? When we talk about differences in terms of debating journeys, I'm pretty sure that you would have been a very different person starting out and to what you have come to right now. So, do you think debating has a chance to change or shape yourself differently? And what do you think has changed in your personality through debating?
When I began and started debating in itself, I used to like view debating as, okay, I'm presenting an argument and there's a counter argument from opposition and just have to defend that or rebut that or stuff like that. At a point of time, I evolved into debating. I like sort of opened up new perspectives into certain problems. I learned to actually analyze or overanalyze certain problems existing, which then looks like that when I'm going ahead and debating to that extent in the current status quo, and not just debating when I'm talking about a problem in my, suppose, engineering problem I'm having, I'm analyzing the why of that problem quite often. I'm analyzing the entire idea that, okay, oh, how exactly is this problem happening? Okay, how can I solve this problem in that extent? I am much better at trying to make policies for individuals, much better at trying to make constitutions for certain like societies which I'm parts of, right? So at a point of time, all of these scenarios are helping me in my life itself. And you would also see a lot of debaters go ahead and become great HRs, right? Why? Because they have the ability to go ahead and, one, convince people, and also the ability to go ahead and like talk to people in itself. So all of these scenarios combined just makes debate a life skill essentially. That you are having the ability to critically think out things, and you're also having the ability to talk to people like I'm just like talking to you as well, right? So that is something which is an inherent skill which debating provides, I think.
Definitely. I think there is a lot of different potential also that debating makes you change a lot in life, because maybe it makes you a better confident speaker. Maybe it makes you present something with less anxiety, because a lot of people have stage fright. Not that debaters don't have stage fright, don't get me wrong. A lot of debaters do have stage fright, performance anxiety, and everything along that end. But it does help to a certain degree. The more that you do something, the easier it becomes for you. But then I think that also changes a lot in terms of the conversations we are having with people around us. It makes us more receptive to hear things out. It makes us more prone towards like solving issues and more capable of being better individuals in the holistic sense of things. But I think that when we're looking at debating as a cultural phenomena, because personality is also an aspect of culture and it changes the different dynamics, I think there are a lot of the different misconceptions that debaters might perceive about other debaters from other countries. So, do you think there are any such misconceptions about your personality or the person or the Indian debate culture that you've seen in international circuits?
The misconceptions essentially regard to the idea that okay, we are underestimated in the international circuits, which then looks like at a point of time they're like we are representing ourselves in an entirely new circuit, like representing ourselves in the American circuit and stuff like that. There is a lot of accent issues which happen with individuals where they can't understand our accent, maybe where they can't understand what we are trying to push, maybe where they can't understand our style of debating to that extent, right? That's where it becomes evidently more important that you realize that what style of debating these guys prefer before going and delving into their circuit, right? Because you as a debater, when you're participating in a tournament and you're delving and debating on your style of debating, it just, and if you're not getting the outcome that you deserve, it just means that you're feeling that okay, unfair judging has occurred, right? Where in the essence it's not essentially that, it's the idea that these people are either having inherent stereotypes about the Indian debating circuit, which stereotypes evolved from the idea that okay, they may not be good speakers essentially, or they may not be mechanization heavy speakers, they are argumentation heavy speakers or something like that. And all of these scenarios and all these stereotypes are existent because there is inherent lack of access to international circuits to a degree in Indian debating circuits as well. Like a normal person, a normal novice starting out cannot just imagine that I am one day going to debate against Harvard or Yale, right? And herein also institutions, like there is some institutional bias coming in where you are not a prominently known individual in that circuit. Reputational bias comes in the eyes of the judge itself because you're not a prominently known individual there. So you might lose, you might face bias, a lot of scenarios can happen. But all of these scenarios are something which through experience, through time, you have to work through and make your way within that circuit itself if you want to grow in that circuit itself. These are barriers which exist and will exist for the end of time, considering that it's inherently like a subjective sport to that extent. At a point of time, you are trying to like be better at it. It then essentially looks like that you are trying to push through these barriers itself. You're trying to push through these stereotypes and prove your metal, prove your merit.
Very true. I think the biases point is very prudent for us to understand different aspects of people and individuals. A, because individuals have different perceptive capabilities and also they have been taught different lived experiences, which we always argue in a debating front, right? That people have certain lived experiences, they experience things culturally different from each other because they have certain environmental factors going around. And I think that comes around our understanding of different individuals as well. So this reputation bias is definitely there. Even I've observed it that people are very confused sometimes approaching new things, and that becomes something which is very evident when they're approaching new styles of debating and new people from different regions as well. But then I think it's something manageable. So over the long term, I hope that it does solve the issues as well. In terms of succeeding though in the long term, people do have certain metrics that they are very focused upon. So as we end, what do you think would be the most crucial for you to succeed in the long term and that you can advise other people also?
It's primarily on the way that you look at debating, which means that, like you said, you need to set specific goals for yourself, which does not look like the idea that, okay, I'm going to win this tournament in this point of time. No. It looks like the idea that you are going ahead and trying to learn new stuff. You're trying to learn how to run meta cases. You're trying to learn, okay, how a specific motion is supposed to run. You're trying to learn how essentially then do you like see that okay, if the opening opposition is covered everything within the case, how do you run a case from closing opposition then? All of these scenarios, all of these nuanced scenarios can only be learned either when you have an institution which teaches you this stuff, or for me as an independent person, or a lot of people who are coming into debating as an independent individual, watching YouTube videos, watching speakers speak, watching WDC speakers speak, and then realizing that you are not so different from them. The difference there lies in the level of experience which they have It lies in the level that they never let themselves be limited by these factors itself. They went ahead and they practiced their sport, they practiced their art, they learned through these scenarios, and they are where they are because they focused on themselves, because they learned and they understood what they are lacking. They took good feedbacks from judges, they went ahead and understood those feedbacks, they had an open mind, and lastly, they went ahead and improved and had years worth of experience to back that improvement in itself. So at a point of time, if you are trying to be a person who can succeed as a novice person, just open yourself up to opportunities. There is something which, like my mentor also says, that you miss 100% of the shot that you don't take. So at a point of time, if you're trying and you're thinking that, okay, should I go into this tournament, go into the tournament, see what happens. Even if you lose, at least you'll learn something from the feedback out of the scenarios. You'll learn that, okay, what does it require for me to convince people? And that essentially is what debating is. That essentially is what your skill is, and that essentially is what you need to develop.
Perfect. So just towards the end, what next for Naman?
I mean, it's just continuing on with this scenario itself. Like, okay, I am currently like sort of mentoring a bunch of my juniors in itself, trying to expose them to certain international circuits as well, trying to expose myself to international debating as well, trying to build my social capital in there so that I can provide an inclusive environment for my juniors as well. So apart from that itself, it's more likely on the idea that okay, I'm also focusing on my corporate life as well. I also have to like get a job itself, right? So continuing on balancing my life with debating in itself, because this is something which I intend to do for my entire life. Like even if I just go ahead and become a judge in certain tournaments, I'm judging tournaments to ensure that okay, these people are judging on the actual metrics of what is supposed to be judged in the first place, right? So all of these scenarios combined then just looks like that okay, I'm trying to make debating a more inclusive space, and I'm also trying to get credentials so that I can provide my experience to the juniors who actually require them in the first place. And just that, I mean, provide accessibility which is people lack, and secondarily just try to make some debaters lives a bit better.
Is there something you'd like to share with our viewers and listeners before we leave? A message or any particular thought?
Yeah, that is the thought, that try to live your life on the metric that you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. So at a point of time that you're realizing that philosophy, make sure that your life reflects that philosophy, because regrets are something which kills an individual from the inside. Don't regret, and very importantly, just do it. That's it. Like, yes, the Nike scenario being that, yes, just do it. We'll see what happens later.
That's a perfect way of ending this episode as well, right? Because people do have to have that motivation to continue, and then just doing something opens up so many more doors than just not doing it. Thank you, Naman. It was very insightful to have you on board. It was a pleasure talking about different aspects of debating and the debating world. I'm pretty sure most of our viewers and listeners would take away something beneficial from this episode. Thank you, and hope to have you again on board soon.
Sure, sure, sure. Thank you, Kaushik, for having me on board as well. And I really love this podcast and hoping that people can, yes, actually gain some level of scenarios from me yapping. Thank you for that.